Sometimes one reads a poem and believes that the poem expresses contradictory ideas, even if it is a great poem. So sometimes I read this poem and I think there's contradicting ideas going on here. So I'm thinking of like a love poem, right? They're saying love is the greatest thing ever or love is terrible. This poem has contradicting ideas. So it is wrong to think that the meaning of a poem is whatever the author intends to communicate to the reader by means of the poem. No one who is writing a great poem intends to communicate contradictory ideas. All right, so our conclusion here is it is wrong to think that the meaning of a poem is whatever the author intends to communicate. And we're saying that because I actually don't even know why we're saying that. I guess we're saying that because nobody that writes great poems intends to communicate contradictory ideas. And sometimes people read poems and they think there's contradictory ideas. So therefore, it's wrong to think that whatever this author wants their poem to come across as is wrong. All right, what kind of question is this?
Necessary assumption.
Yeah, so it's like what's needed in order for our conclusion to be true. This is one that I crossed off a lot, the answer choices as I went, and I had to think about the correct answer for a while. So different readers will usually disagree. Do we need different users to usually disagree?
No.
Nope. So that's why A is wrong. Yeah.
To cut you off. Like I know, like when we had like our one-on-one, you're like you mentioned about predictions. So like for this question, like how
Necessary assumption questions can be very hard to predict.
Yeah.
Because there can be so many. So here I'm thinking like what's needed in order this to be true, is what to think the meaning of the poem intends to communicate. It is wrong to think. So there, I guess like for this to be true, there has to be more, I mean, this is silly, but there has to be more meanings of a poem than just what the poet intends. I guess
like,
my prediction.
like not even necessarily like a prediction, like but like do you notice something off about this? Because I know like when I was watching the explanation on Demon, like they picked up on like a term shift and stuff like that.
A term shift? Oh, okay. Yes. So what they're talking about there, and this happens a lot in sufficient assumption questions, where it's like we bring in this new term or this new whatever, and it has nothing to do with our conclusion. So what would be our new term? But here, I don't think this is a great example because we don't really bring in a new term here. I guess we bring in whatever the author intends. The meaning of a poem is what the author intends to communicate by the reader, communicate by the means of the poem. I don't really see, I feel like we have kind of all the terms going on here.
Because like okay, so what Demon said was that the meaning of the poem, that's the
New one?
you talk about contradicting ideas, and like that is that the same thing as meaning of the poem? We don't know, right?
No, I would say that, yeah. So we're saying a poem expresses contradictory ideas. So, and then we have the meaning of a poem. No, I would say those are different terms.
So
I didn't pick up on that, but yeah. So I guess what we're assuming that the expressing of contradictory ideas is like those, maybe whatever those are expressing are the meanings of the poem.
Okay.
So some people really teach that unnecessary assumptions, like finding the new term. I don't think about it that way because I think it overcomplicates it.
Okay.
For necessary assumptions, I think Alyssa might have told me this before. Like, do you try to find the gap between the conclusion and the argument of that or am I saying that right, Alyssa? I always look at the gap.
Sufficient, yes. Yeah, sufficient.
For necessary, I go, when I go beat, does this have to be true? Like I kind of almost approach them in like a must be true way.
Like I always say, is this needed? And that would be the same as must be true, because necessary, needed. Sufficient is like stronger. So it's like, if we have these premises and we have this conclusion, how do we get from that premise to that conclusion?
But like, don't necessary assumption questions like usually have like a flaw, right? Like they have a flaw, right? Like,
yeah, they do, but I think you're overthinking. I think you might be overthinking them, where you can go into that level of detail, but really they're asking yourself, like, do you know what the bare minimum that this argument needs?
I see. So like also treat them as like a must be true than like a flaw question. Like,
yes,
oh,
yes. I think because honestly, because like necessary, because there's I think it's it's either prep test 82 or 86 that has three or four necessary assumption questions in one of the sections, and they don't do the gap thing on the necessary assumptions, and you truly have to understand. Did we do it, Alyssa?
It might have. I feel like the recent tests I've done have had like 3 or 4 necessary assumption questions.
You have to truly understand the goal of a necessary. It's like, is this needed? And it doesn't actually bridge a gap. But you have to. It's like there's a question about like the birds and the pigeon.
Oh, yeah.
The pigeon birds, and like, what does this have to happen? And it brings in something new, but it's like, yeah, technically that would be needed. So this one, our answers, okay, so I'm just gonna keep going through this, how I would cross them off. So if someone writes a great poem, he or she intends the poem, like, no, we don't need there to be one primary idea. And like, this is, if someone writes a great poem, like, no, that's too specific. C says, readers will not agree about the meaning of a poem if they do not agree about what the author of the poem intended the poem to mean. It's like, no, we don't have to agree about, hey, this is what, I don't know, Maya Angelou meant about this poem, so we can't agree about what we think the meaning of the poem is. No. D says, anyone reading a great poem can discern every idea the author intended to express. So does it have to be true that everyone reading a great poem can determine every idea? No.
That's more like a sufficient assumption answer. Or
Yeah,
that's more like
it would be more along those lines. Yeah, that it is wrong to think. Yes. And then E says, if a reader believes that a poem expresses a particular idea, then that idea is part of the meaning of the poem. I don't like this answer, but it's going back to, we believe that it expresses contradictory ideas. And so these contradictory ideas must be a part of like the meaning of the poem.
Is it also kind of saying like expressing kind of like what we were talking about, like expressing a meaning, like, what am I trying to say? Like if you express it, then you must mean it, and that's not correct.
Or if a reader thinks it expresses it, then it must be part of it, more so. So it's more so like this says like, if the reader believes it happens, it's at least partially true. So it goes against, like, it's not just the author, which is what we're trying to show, is like, it's wrong to think that the author is the only thing that gets to determine the meaning of a poem. And so if it's not the author, then what's left? The reader.
Mm-hmm.
So the reader has to have at least some say in that meaning of the poem.
Got it.
Do you see that, Mohib? This is one that I would get through by crossing all of them off, and I'm not loving even like, yeah, okay, I can see.
And like if you were to negate, just be like, if a reader believes a poem expresses a particular idea, then that idea is not part of the poem or meaning of the poem.
Yep.
And that goes against, because we're saying that like the conclusion is that it's wrong to.
Yeah. And this so here is important here. We're saying like, hey, sometimes when one reads a poem, they have contradictory ideas. So it's wrong to think. So we're basing that conclusion off of this premise. So that's our reasoning for it. Because if we take this away, there's nothing left.
Right.
But yeah, that not there is really good too.